Hello and welcome. This is For a Better Tomorrow, the University of Derby's Innovation and Research podcast. I'm Lewis Alsop, and every episode I chat to someone in academia about what they're working on and how it will make our lives better. Now, in previous episodes, I've spoken to researchers answering questions like how we can use computers to help us understand the world and how mirrors are helping us to make solar energy more efficient. But today, I want to talk history. Although I don't really. You see, one of the ways that we can try and make society better in the here and now is actually by looking back through the archives to understand events of the past. And today, I want to talk about just that. How can analysis of events from the past inform our current decision making? Well, to help me find out, I'm joined by Professor Keith McLay, who's Provost of Learning and Teaching here at the University of Derby, as well as being a historian. It's lovely to see you. I mean, before we get into all of that, just tell me a bit about you first of all.
My name is Professor Keith McLay, and I'm the Provost Learning and Teaching at the University of Derby, which is quite an odd title in many respects. When you say provost, not many people know what that is or what that means. I'm not necessarily sure I do, but in reality what it means is that in terms of the university's learning and teaching, its curricula, its academic offer, I'm the university's executive member who has responsibility for that across the institution. So I work with the colleges, I work with the programme teams in respect of the degrees that we offer here at the University of Derby and the learning and teaching which delivers those degree programmes.
History. How did you get into it?
I just was fascinated by it at school. History is marvellous for providing that illustrative example to help one understand the modern world at the most broadest level or at the micro level as well. And history is wonderful for that. And cast of characters, what you can analyse, what you can study, the phenomena that are part of history as well, all are educational and teaches, and there's nothing better than, I just love it. I just love history, and that's why I became an academic, got into teaching it, and I still, even though I have this title provost and that's a leadership role there, I have always throughout my career maintained both my teaching commitments, so I deliver a level 4 module with a colleague still, and keep the research not at a very, very high level or high tempo because I have other things to do, but to keep working on it as well.
We're talking about innovation and research, a very important part of what the university does, obviously. And you've got something to talk about today, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what I wanted to talk about in terms of my own research is I'm working on the Jacobites at the moment. Now, the Jacobites, for those that maybe are not familiar with them, was a group of individuals within the Isles of Britain in the 18th century, primarily. They were adherents of the King James VII and II, who was effectively evicted from the throne in 1688 from Britain, and they were a group of individuals that wanted to see the Stuart House restored to the thrones of the British Isles, and they mounted a series of rebellions periodically through the first half of the 18th century. So the initial one was just at the end of the 17th in 1689. Then we had one in 1707, 1708, and then we had a big one in 1715 and an even bigger one in 1745. And the one that I'm looking at the moment is that one in 1745, because the Stuart adherents started off in Scotland, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the grandson of James VII and II, and they marched all the way to Derby. They started off in the Western Isles of Scotland, and they managed to march all the way down to Derby. And it was at Derby in December 1745 that they actually decided to turn around and retreat back to Scotland. And it's that decision and that command decision which I think is interesting me at the moment. And it's interesting me at one level because it's a historical question, and I'm a historian, so I'm interested in historical questions. But it's also interesting because there's an application on that piece of research, which is in terms of leadership, how do we arrive at significant decisions, be they political, be they military, be they civil? How do we arrive at that type of decision which can have such a consequential impact upon the subsequent events? Because the decision to retreat in the 5th of December 1745 and return to Scotland was absolutely seminal in terms of the ill-fated success of the rebellion ultimately. And so that has a modern application, which I'm interested in as well.
Yeah, it's a wider question, like you say, just about leadership.
Yeah.
How are you going to find this out? Because we can't ask anybody.
No, that's right, of course. So a historian's methods of research are primarily twofold. So there's a body of secondary literature, works by historians already on a topic that you would access and you'd read and you would think about. But most importantly for historians, it's the surviving documentary record or archival sources that you would go to piece together that, in this instance, the decision-making process. So in other words, I'm looking at correspondence, I'm looking at diaries and memoirs, and trying to understand through reading them and triangulating different pieces of evidence how that leadership decision came about.
You're looking into this one decision. It's a very specific time in history. What have you found so far? Have you found anything about the reason behind that one decision?
Yes, what I've found, or what my analysis has been, is that to date, that decision on the 5th of December in the War Council of the Jacobites in Derby was primarily characterised as being a purely military decision. In other words, historians have said hitherto, Bonnie Prince Charlie and his fellow generals decided to retreat to Scotland because there were 3 columns of the British Army converging on Derby from the north and from the south and from the southwest. So therefore, militarily, they were never going to be successful in fighting through to London.
So this is where the big sort of explosion was going to be, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But my argument is that was but one element. The military element was but one facet of the decision. What we need to do is to broaden it out to look at other elements of the decision. So there were political considerations within the War Council themselves. So the War Council was divided between Bonnie Prince Charlie's advisors who had come from Ireland and his advisors who had come from Scotland. Those that had come from Scotland were much more inclined to make good the gains that they had achieved in Scotland already by retreating back to Scotland and holding that position. The Irish contingent were much more enthusiastic to go all the way to London because for them that was the bigger prize.
So was there a bit of a fallout?
Absolutely, yeah. There was a bit of faction and internecine fighting within the War Council, which was politically founded. There was the wider context of support for the Jacobites within Great Britain at the time, that there was the assumption that because the Jacobites had got to Derby, that clearly they had more support than actually they did. And by the time they got to Derby, it became increasingly apparent that people were not turning out for the Jacobites. So they had marched all the way down from Scotland and through the northwest of England, then turned eastwards to Derby. But they hadn't raised many men on their travels. They had been successful in their march. They hadn't been opposed, but they hadn't brought many people along with them. So fundamentally, another element of the decision was their support was thin. And
thinner than they expected.
Indeed, absolutely. And if they were going to march on to London, then they were going to have to need more support than they had accrued already. And then the third element in broadening out is a diplomatic context. When Bonnie Prince Charlie left the continent of Europe to come across to Scotland in late 1744, there was assumption that the France in particular, but also the Vatican and to an extent Spain, would provide some succour, some support for the Jacobite rebellion, particularly France. And indeed, Bonnie Prince Charlie's brother Henry was in France at the time in 45, seeking to bring together support. that support never materialised, and by the time they reached Derby in December 45, it was increasingly clear that the international context was not going to come through for them. So that was another element in the decision making. So hopefully the research is beginning to demonstrate that where before a decision was characterised as one of purely military considerations that will never be successful in fighting through, is now one actually which is much broader and has a number of contributory elements to it.
It was interesting you were speaking about earlier how this can help us in life today in understanding the way that decisions are made and understanding how decisions should be made, because that's, I suppose, a really important part of our life politically. It's very important, isn't it?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely agree. You're quite right. And I suppose what I'm trying to show in the modern context, so I talked about the applied nature of this work, and the applied nature is current contemporary leadership decision making. I think first of all what I would say is that there needs to be a recognition that in any such decision-making process, particularly one that is of significant size and scale, there are a number of what we would call heuristics or biases at work. In the Jacobite example, we talked about the political context. Well, that was a bias that they had that was feeding through. So likewise, in any contemporary decision, you need to recognise that the parties to that decision have a number of ingrained biases and prejudices that are coming to the fore.
And we see this all the time in politics, in lots of different decisions. Yeah. People often are biased by the way that they've grown up, the way that they've lived their life, the people that they owe money to. Do you know what I mean? There's lots of different things that can affect our decision making, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely correct there, Lewis. And by applying that research, by using the historical example, we can shed light upon the processes of the contemporary world in terms of leadership arriving at decisions, and demonstrating that any decision is much more broadly based than how one might like to characterise it. One might like to say, oh, well, that decision was taken because of X and only X. That's unlikely to be the case, and we can use the historical example to illustrate that.
How does this help us now? So this understanding, which is really genuinely very interesting, the way that we make decisions, but how does it help us in our lives now to understand that this is the way decisions are made?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think my answer to that was it's important that leaders, across the country, across the world, anyone in a leadership position has a better knowledge and understanding of how they arrive at decisions and decision making and command in that context. Now, they might not want to particularly know that. They might not want to know that they bring prejudices and bias to the table, but they do need to understand that.
Because I suppose it's a matter of understanding that we've all got them. We've all got prejudices. We've all got biases. But it's a matter of understanding when to leave them to the side, or as best we can, when not to.
Yeah.
Just finally, speaking about leadership once again, if I were to want to be Prime Minister, what advice would you give me, given the research that you've done?
Okay. Understand your prejudices, understand your biases, and understand people. And ensure that when you are taking a decision in any step, that you have a broad a base as possible in terms of knowledge of the issue that you're seeking to take a decision on before you take that decision.
I think I might get my name on the ballot paper now.
Good luck to you.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much, Lewis. That was great. Thank you.
That is Professor Keith McLay, Provost of Learning and Teaching at the University of Derby and a historian. And that is it for this episode of For a Better Tomorrow, the University of Derby's Innovation and Research podcast. Now, in other episodes in the series, I've looked at the research answering questions like why research itself is so important to the University of Derby, and how can proteins help combat the onset of Alzheimer's. They're available now, so be sure to check them out wherever you get your podcasts and follow the university at Derby Uni. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. For a Better Tomorrow was presented by me, Lewis Alsop, and produced by myself and Dr. Dahi McMahon in the School of Arts for the University of Derby.